This is still unanswered. I'm Erica Maldonado. Today, we're returning to a case that, for people who lived in the Chicago suburbs, has felt like an open wound for nearly 2 decades. The Lane Bryant murders in Tinley Park, Illinois. February 2nd, 2008. 6 women in a clothing store. 5 dead, 1 survivor. No arrest, no answers. This episode is called 6 Women, 1 Killer, 0 Answers. Before we begin, a content note. We'll discuss sexual violence and graphic details of murder. We'll protect the identity of the lone survivor out of respect and safety. She has never been publicly named, and we will not name her. If these topics are difficult for you, please take care of yourself and skip when you need to. Okay, let's start. Tinley Park is a southwest suburb of Chicago, about 25 to 30 miles from downtown. In 2008, it felt like a safe place. Family neighborhoods, strip malls you shopped at on a Saturday morning. Brookside Marketplace, an open-air shopping center with the usual anchors, Target, Best Buy, restaurants, and among them, a Lane Bryant store, a chain that sells plus-size women's clothing, a store many women would pop into to shop. That morning, Saturday, February the 2nd, the store opened at 10 a.m. People went about their business. But in the space of half an hour, everything changed. At roughly 10:15 a.m., a man came in through the back door. He claimed he was a delivery driver. He spoke briefly with the store manager, Rhoda McFarland, and with the part-time employee who later survived. Customers were in the store, shopping, trying things on, getting ready for the day. By the time the man had finished speaking, there were 6 women in the store: the manager, the part-timer, and 4 customers: Rhoda, Connie Woolfolk, Jennifer Bishop, Carrie Huddock, and Sarah Zafransky. They were ordinary people doing ordinary things that Saturday morning. What followed is one of the most chilling 30 minutes in recent Illinois history. The man revealed a handgun, a Glock .40 caliber, and announced a robbery. He forced all 6 women into the small back room, bound their hands behind their backs, and then, according to investigators, it became much worse. They were shot. 5 died. 1 survived. I want to be very careful here. The specifics we'll talk about come from police reports, media coverage at the time, and documentation we've reviewed for this episode. Where there's uncertainty, I'll say so. This is an episode about what we know, what we don't know, and why those unknowns are still a wound for families and a hazard for the community. Let me bring you in. Detective Marcus Ellison, retired Tinley Park consultant and homicide investigator across Illinois. Marcus, when you first heard about this case in 2008, what was your impression? What did it look like on day 1?
Erica, thanks. I remember it like it was yesterday. Even for a homicide detective used to violence, the set of circumstances made no sense. A suburban strip mall store, a Saturday morning? On paper it reads like a robbery, but then you walk the scene and you see 5 women executed in a back room. That's not typical for a straight robbery. There are too many signs of overkill. The immediacy was get in, secure the scene, gather evidence, and most importantly, talk to the survivor gently, because she was the only person who could describe the attacker.
Right. And that survivor, the part-time employee, she was bound and shot, but not killed. She was grazed in the neck after shifting, which may have saved her life. Her testimony is the linchpin for almost everything that followed: the physical description, the voice, the sequence of events. But Marcus, even with that eyewitness, and with shell casings and fingerprints left at the scene, they still haven't made a match. How does that happen?
There are a few ways, Erica. First, even a great eyewitness can be traumatized. Memory is honest but fragile. Second, fingerprints and DNA are only useful if they exist in a database. If this man had no prior arrest records requiring prints or a DNA sample, we won't find a match. Third, evidence can be contaminated if the scene is chaotic. That's a risk in retail mass casualty scenes, but from what I understand in Tinley Park, the evidence collected was solid. Shell casings, fingerprints, the 911 audio with the suspect's voice, and possible DNA linked to a sexual assault claim. They had what we call testable evidence. The trouble was, no hits in APHIS, no hits in CODIS.
The voice, you mentioned the audio. Rhoda McFarland managed to make a 911 call from inside the store, whispering. Investigators have the recording, and, crucially, the offender's gruff voice is audible. That recording hasn't been publicly released, but it exists. How useful is a recording like that?
A voice recording can be invaluable. You can use voice analysis technology. Sometimes it helps witnesses remember additional details. But unlike fingerprints and DNA, voice evidence is only as useful as someone recognizing that voice. Unless the killer left a unique linguistic marker, or the voice matches an audio sample you already have tied to a suspect, it's hard to make a conclusive identification in court with voice alone. It helps you direct witnesses. Did anyone hear anyone talking like this? It's more of an investigative tool than a forensic knockout, unless you can match it to a known recording or a confession.
What the survivor described and what the composite sketch later portrayed is unusually specific. A black man, about 5'9" to 6 feet tall, stocky, cornrowed hair with a receding hairline, and notably a long braid at the right cheek with 4 light green beads at the end. Marks like that are memorable. Yet hundreds of tips later, nothing that led to an arrest. Marcus, does that frustrate you?
Frustrate? I mean, that's an understatement. As investigators, we live for those distinctive identifiers because people remember quirks, a hairstyle, a scar, a particular word someone uses. The fact the killer had a detailed, odd feature like 4 green beads on a braid and still slipped through the cracks tells you either one of two things. He changed his appearance quickly, or he lived a life where he wasn't connected to systems we could search. He could have left the area, cut the hair, dyed it, or simply avoided anything that would put his prints or DNA into a government database. We did everything we could on the front end, but databases only help if your person is in them.
Let's pause and talk about the women, because if these cases are going to stay victim-centered, and they must, we owe them that. Rhoda McFarland, 42, was the store manager. Her funeral drew hundreds. Connie Woolfolk, 37, a mortgage manager and mother of 2. Jennifer Bishop, 34, a nurse from South Bend, visiting with her husband. Carrie Chuso, 33, a school social worker from Frankfurt, remembered by her brother Mike, who still advocates for justice. And Sarah Safransky, 22, a recent grad shopping for a first job. These were ordinary lives, ordinary futures that were ended in half an hour. Marcus, your thoughts on how prosecutors and detectives should foreground victims' lives in an investigation like this?
It's crucial. Investigations are about facts, but your compass should be the victims. We photograph their closets, their desks, their phone histories, all in the service of understanding motive or connections. You also treat the family as a partner when possible, because they can provide context about the victim's routines, people they knew, anything that might matter. In Tinley Park, detectives spent a lot of time with families, and they were careful not to speculate publicly. That was smart. You don't want the public blaming people who are innocent. But emotionally, yeah, you're always thinking these were someone's mother, someone's sister, someone's friend.
One of the haunting things about this case is the combination of elements: the delivery driver ruse, the robbery demand, the binding and control of victims in the back room. the sexual assault, then the execution-style killings. The official line early on was a robbery that went rather poorly, but that doesn't explain the sexual assault or the execution-style shots to the head. Can you help listeners understand how motive becomes murky in crimes like this?
Sure. Motive is the hardest thing to prove after the act. If someone robs a store and walks out, that's straightforward. If you tie up and shoot people and there's sexual assault, then you're looking at multiple possible motivations overlapping: robbery, sexual predation, sadistic violence, or even a targeted attack. The evidence at Lane Bryant suggests the robbery pretext is real, the door ruse, mention of taking money, but the level of violence goes beyond a quick grab and run. Sometimes the offender's intent shifts in the moment. Panic turns to anger, to control. Other times it was always a plan. Without a confession or a clear history tied to the suspect, we can't say which is true here. We must treat all possibilities and preserve all evidence.
I want to acknowledge something else. The survivor has to live with memory, trauma, and the knowledge that her account is the one thing that could put a murderer behind bars. Imagine the burden. If you think about it, having the responsibility of remembering when your memory is under siege. The families have had to wait for justice for 18 years. People like Mike Huddock, he says he focuses on who Carrie was instead of how she died, but he still calls for someone to speak up. That balance of remembrance and demand is such a painful moral posture. Marcus, how do investigators maintain momentum for a case when the public's attention fades?
It's one of the most frustrating realities. In the immediate aftermath, you're throwing resources at a case: task forces, media appeals, rewards. Tinley Park had a task force that included county and federal partners. They chased thousands of leads, literally over 5,000 to 6,000. But investigations are resource-intensive, and attention decays. Detectives try to institutionalize the work, digitize evidence, maintain cold case files, reanalyze DNA as technology improves. They also rely on anniversaries, documentaries, and media hits to generate new tips. That's exactly why the recent documentary and renewed coverage are valuable. They can prompt someone who once kept quiet to finally step forward.
Let's talk numbers. The reward in this case was initially $50,000 and later raised to $100,000, half contributed by Lane Bryant's parent company. That reward still stands. There was a time in the first year when police said they'd taken over 6,000 calls. Now, tip volumes have dwindled to dozens a year. Why does that matter? Because mass tips early on can uncover small consistencies that later become leads. But as noise drops, the coldness sets in. Marcus, do rewards work? Do they really bring forward people who will solve cases?
They can. Rewards change the calculus for someone who knows something and was incentivized by fear or loyalty to stay quiet. Maybe they're thinking, if I talk, I lose this person in my life, or I get pushed out of a community. A material incentive can be the nudge that cuts through. We saw this in other cases historically. So $100,000 is meaningful. It shows the families and the company still want closure. It doesn't guarantee tips, but it moves the needle.
We should talk about the physical evidence in a bit more detail, because there are real forensic threads in this case. Shell casings, .40 caliber Glock casings were found. Fingerprints, believed to be from the killer, were lifted. Police have mentioned DNA consistent with sexual assault was collected, and yet no matches in APHIS or CODIS. Marcus, for listeners who aren't forensic people, what does it mean when prints or DNA don't match?
It means exactly what it sounds like. No one in the existing databases matched those profiles. For fingerprints, APHIS contains prints from people who've been fingerprinted: arrests, employment in certain sectors, government IDs in older systems. For DNA, CODIS includes convicted offenders and some arrestees, depending on state law and era. If a perpetrator has never been fingerprinted or had their DNA entered into CODIS, law enforcement can't match. That's why modern genetic genealogy, using consumer DNA databases where people voluntarily upload profiles, has revolutionized cold cases. But its use is limited by legal and policy constraints, and not all departments use it. So you may have great evidence that, in theory, could solve the case if matched, but only if the suspect's biological relatives have profiles in the right databases, or the suspect himself has a record somewhere.
And to be clear, use of consumer genealogy requires careful legal guardrails. It raises privacy concerns, it raises ethical debates. But when it works, as in the Brown's Chicken Massacre years earlier in Palatine, DNA from a seemingly trivial item, a chicken bone, eventually led to arrests years later. That case is the precedent victims' advocates and detectives point to with hope. Marcus, do you think investigators in Tinley Park have revisited their evidence with newer tech?
From everything I've heard, and from the statements police have made, yes. The Tinley Park investigation has never been shelved. Detectives have said they continually reevaluate leads, retest evidence as methods improve, and work with federal partners when needed. The challenge is access to resources and policy. But the presence of untested or retestable evidence, fingerprints, DNA, means the possibility exists for a breakthrough as databases expand and techniques improve.
Let's walk through that day, minute by minute, as best we can. Store opens at 10 a.m. The suspect enters the back door around 10:15. He presents as a delivery driver. He speaks with Rhoda. At some point, he reveals a gun and forces the women into the back room. He binds them. The 911 call happens around 10:44 to 10:45. Rhoda manages to whisper into the phone from inside. The suspect's voice is captured on that call, gruff, giving commands, before the line goes dead. A nearby officer, parked at the target, arrives within 1 to 2 minutes and finds 5 dead, 1 alive. The killer is gone. That timeline is horrifying because it compresses terror into such a short time.
Yes, and from an investigative standpoint, that 30-minute window is both a curse and a gift. It's a curse because it means the suspect had time to bind, assault, and execute. It's a gift because you have a tight time frame to trace his movements before and after the crime. In many cases, close-in CCTV from nearby stores can help. Tinley Park investigators canvassed the entire mall, used helicopter searches, dogs, and media appeals. They also worried about the suspect escaping into surrounding neighborhoods. But back in 2008, surveillance coverage wasn't as pervasive or high definition as it is now, which limits what you can glean after the fact.
That detail about surveillance is interesting because when you compare 2008 to today, so many more eyes are digital and connected. There's more chance someone captured a vehicle, a hat, a vantage of a face. Which brings us to the composite sketch released about a week later, based on the survivor's account. The delay was intentional. Investigators didn't want to rush it. The sketch emphasized the braid, the beads, the receding hairline, the stocky build. This sketch generated hundreds of tips, but none of those tips led to a confirmed arrest. Marcus, sketches used to be a central tool. In the age of high-res photos, do composites still matter?
They do. A skilled composite can jog memories. But the way people perceive images varies, and sketches are subjective to both the artist and the witness. In this case, the survivor described very distinct elements, the braids, the beads, which should have increased recall. But again, we run into the same issue. Even with great leads, you need corroborating evidence to make an arrest. Tips without proof are tips. They must be investigated, which takes resources. Sketches create leads, and leads create work.
We're going to talk in a bit about the main theories people have floated: a botched robbery, a sexually motivated attack, a transient predator, maybe someone who later died or was incarcerated under a different identity. But before we go deeper into speculation, I want to stress something to listeners. When I talk about theories on this show, I do so to explore investigative possibilities, not to point fingers. There's a sharp ethical line to walk. We must avoid naming uncharged people or repeating internet speculation as if it's fact. Marcus, how do investigators balance following theories with protecting people from false accusations?
You do a careful, evidence-first approach. You canvass, you compare stories, you check alibis, you look for physical overlap. If someone looks like the composite, you don't arrest them immediately. You investigate. We ran down hundreds of tips in cases like this. The public sometimes wants a quick answer, but justice requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We also have to protect the rights of people who are suspects in the public eye. That's why police rarely broadcast every lead, because wrongful public suspicion can ruin lives and complicate actual investigations.
Let's take a breath. There's a human story here beyond the forensics. Families held funerals. Lane Bryant's parent company paid for funerals and set up a memorial fund. Clothing from the front of the store was donated to charities. The store itself sat vacant for about 6 years before becoming a TJ Maxx in 2013. Some people see that as practical. Businesses move on. Others see it as erasure. What do you think, Marcus? Is repurposing a crime scene building a form of community healing or a kind of forgetting? What do you think, Marcus? Is repurposing a crime scene building a form of community healing or a kind of forgetting?
It depends who you ask. For some survivors and families, the storefront is a daily reminder, and having it sit empty can feel like perpetual mourning. For community planners and business owners, leaving a building vacant can be economically unsustainable. Some communities put memorials in place at the site. Others choose to reassign the space but hold memorial services elsewhere. There's no one right answer. What matters is that the memory of the victims isn't erased, that their stories are honored. If remodeling a building helps the community feel safer and usable without forgetting, that's one thing. If it's a cover-up of grief, that's another. Ideally, the community would have both, a living space and a space of remembrance.
I want to play devil's advocate for a second. Some people ask, could the offender have been a transient, someone who didn't live in the area? Could he have left Illinois immediately after? Marcus?
Yes, absolutely possible. The attacker may have planned his escape route, used the back door, and left in a vehicle that was never captured on usable video. He may have had ties elsewhere, or he could have cut his hair and changed his appearance. The braids and beads were distinctive, but hair changes fast. Transient offenders are harder to capture because they slip out of local investigative nets. That's why federal cooperation matters. Crossings of state lines, ballistics ties to other crimes, or DNA links elsewhere can break a case.
On the subject of other crimes, the Brown's Chicken Massacre in Palatine, 1993, is often referenced. That case went unsolved for 9 years, but was cracked when DNA on a chicken bone matched a suspect. It's often cited as evidence that cold cases can be solved years later as forensic methods improve. Is that the kind of precedent that gives you and families real hope?
It does. Brown's Chicken is a painful but hopeful precedent. It shows meticulous evidence preservation pays off. DNA that seemed useless in the moment can become decisive years later. The Tinley Park case has preserved evidence, shell casings, fingerprints, potential DNA. If those samples can be re-examined with fresh techniques, or if a relative of the killer unknowingly puts their DNA into a consumer database in a way that aids investigators under legal protocols, the case could break. It's not fantasy. We've seen these breakthroughs happen, but they often require luck, persistence, and interagency cooperation.
Let me bring it back to the survivors and families for a moment. Mike Hodick, Carrie's brother, has been outspoken about keeping Carrie's memory alive and about the need for someone to talk. Families often carry the burden of keeping the story public. There's a documentary out this year, The Tinley Park 5, produced by Charlie Min, former America's Most Wanted producer. It's due in February, timed with the anniversary. Documentaries can reignite attention. They can, however, also reopen wounds. How should families weigh the decision to participate in public retellings?
That's a deeply personal choice. Some families find strength and purpose in public advocacy. It can bring leads, keep pressure on cold case units, and ensure the victims aren't forgotten. Others are re-traumatized by public retellings and prefer privacy. Ideally, producers approach families with sensitivity, informed consent, and a clear sense of how the film can help the investigation. If it builds awareness and leads to tips that help catch the killer, many families see that as worth the pain. But every family makes that choice on their own terms.
As we talk about renewed attention, it's important to tell listeners what they can do. If you are listening and you think you saw someone with cornrows and a braided side with green beads in the weeks around February 2nd, 2008, or if you heard something in your neighborhood, or you have a memory you dismissed at the time, please call the Tinley Park Police Department tip line or submit information through official law enforcement channels. There's a reward of $100,000 for information leading to an arrest. I won't list numbers here because phone lines change. Check Tinley Park PD's official site or contact Crime Stoppers. Even small details matter.
Erica, one small addition. If someone has information, take a note of specifics, dates, locations, vehicles, license plates, nicknames, where a person worked. Those anchor points make a tip actionable. Also, if you're worried about safety, most agencies offer anonymous tip lines. Please don't assume someone else will call. For cold cases, a single tip can be the hinge that opens an entire new line of inquiry.
Thank you, Marcus. I want to take a few minutes to walk through some of the theories people often discuss online. And I want to be clear again, these are theories, not accusations. Theory 1 is a botched robbery by an inexperienced or panicked offender. Evidence for that? The delivery ruse, demand for money, the retail setting. Evidence against? The excessive violence and sexual assault, which is not typical in a quick robbery. Theory 2, a sexual predator or serial offender passing through. The sexual assault suggests this possibility, but no matching crimes or DNA ties have been publicly confirmed. Theory 3, a targeted attack. Police have not found evidence that any of the women were specifically targeted, and families say they see no reason why any of the victims would have been singled out. Theory 4, the offender left town, cut his hair, and faded into obscurity, or he died or is incarcerated under another identity. Marcus, anything you'd add or push back on there?
You covered the reasonable spectrum well. I just emphasize that in cold cases, the most useful theories are the ones that lead to discrete investigation steps. Check medical records, employment records, delivery logs for that date. Compare DNA to unsolved sexual assaults. Run ballistics against statewide databases. Re-interview witnesses with fresh cognitive techniques. Theories are fine as long as they're productive. Wild speculation that points at innocent people does harm and wastes resources.
In the years after the killing, detectives analyzed thousands of leads, spent tens of thousands of investigative hours, searched out similar crimes, and kept the case open. Tinley Park's police chief has repeatedly said the case is active. Families and advocates have held memorials on anniversary years. The store's vacancy, then its conversion, the memorial funds, the donated clothing, all these actions are part of a community trying to respond. But the unanswered question remains: why was justice not served? Marcus, when a case like this doesn't end in an arrest, how does it affect community trust in law enforcement? How should departments respond?
It's a tough situation. Public trust erodes when people see horrific crimes go unsolved, especially in communities that pride themselves on safety. Departments must be transparent about what they can say without compromising investigations. They should show continued commitment, regular updates, digitizing case files, using new technologies, and maintaining lines of communication with families. Continuing outreach, like a documentary or anniversary reminders, can be part of that, but it's critical the messaging doesn't create false hope. Honesty and persistence are key.
We're coming up on the end of the episode, but I want to close with something personal. I grew up in the southwest suburbs. I remember the shock of those headlines when I was a young reporter in Chicago. For many people, these murders were an arrow through the idea of a safe suburban Saturday. We talk a lot in this show about still unanswered, not just as a slogan. It's a moral designation. It marks responsibility to remember, to investigate, to speak up if you know something. Marcus, any final words for our listeners in the Chicago area who might remember something but dismissed it as small?
Don't dismiss small things. Memory is odd. Something you've long buried can become crucial. If you remember a person who suddenly cut their hair, or a friend who moved away in February 2008, or a vehicle seen near Brookside Market, call the tip line. You can remain anonymous. And to the families, keep pressing. It's not easy, but persistence matters. Eventually, forensic science or human courage breaks cases. Keep the pressure on. And Erica, to all of you listening, don't let the victims fade from your memory. Their lives deserve more than being a footnote.
If you're hearing this and you think you know something, please contact the Tinley Park Police Department through official channels, or check our episode notes for resources and guidance on submitting information. There's a $100,000 reward for anything leading to an arrest. I also want to tell you that the documentary, The Tinley Park 5, opens in Chicago area theaters on February 13th. It's produced by Charlie Men and has prompted renewed coverage in People and NBC Chicago. Media attention like this can bring someone forward. But remember, if you come forward, do it through proper law enforcement channels. Don't post accusations online. Protect the investigation and protect the innocent. Before we sign off, I want to read the victims' names one more time, slowly to honor them. Rhoda McFarland, Connie Woolfolk, Jennifer Bishop, Carrie Chism, Sarah Safransky. And to the woman who survived, we hold your courage in respect and in confidentiality. Marcus, thank you for your time, for your candor, and for your continued work on cold cases. Listeners, if you want to support the work of Still Unanswered, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode. Not because we want numbers, but because awareness keeps cases in people's minds. Someone listening might be the one who finally remembers.
Thank you, Erica. It's been important to talk about this one, and I hope it brings in new information.
This is Still Unanswered. I'm Erica Maldonado. Special thanks to Detective Marcus Ellison. Sources for this episode include reporting from NBC Chicago, People Magazine, The Washington Post, ABC7, local Shaw Local reporting, contemporary coverage from 2008, and case files and statements from the Tinley Park Police Department. For details and links, check our show notes. If you have information, please go through official law enforcement channels. The victims in Tinley Park deserve justice. The rest of us, we owe them attention. We'll be back next week with another episode of Still Unanswered. Until then, take care of each other.